So, hello, can you hear me?
Sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Do is, we're going to, for this lecture and the next lecture, we are going to actually try and understand what is it that Adam Smith actually said. Okay? Because as Amartya Sen has actually said, some are born small, some have some achieve smallness, but Adam Smith has had a lot of smallness thrust upon him. Right? So let's try to actually understand what is it that Adam Smith actually seems quite relevant to our current debates. And very often what we're told about Adam Smith and what's there in the Wealth of Nations and generally about classical economics is quite different from what actually is there in Adam Smith. So I've written a note and I've combined some lectures together. So I'll actually have to we'll read out a few things to you. All right. So let's first start with uh, so as long as I'm audible, that's fine because the lights here aren't too good. So give me, I just switch on the lights here so that I can. So all of you know that Adam Smith wrote this very important book called Wealth of Nations. Yeah. So before Adam Smith, there were two important strands in thinking which Adam Smith related to. One was what is called mercantilism. Now, mercantilism actually was the idea that the country becomes richer the more the bullion it has, the more the gold and silver it has. So the idea was that all countries must always develop trade surpluses. You should sell more than what you can buy so that your country accumulates gold and silver. And if you have gold and silver, then of course you are a richer country. And that was the general idea behind mercantilism. Now, all of us know that there is a problem with this act, right? Okay, because it's not the objective is not really to only keep on running trade surplus. The world as a whole can never run a trade surplus. And secondly, if you actually run a surplus on the balance of trade, then you must run a deficit on the balance of, on the other balance. So basically on the capital account. So basically, that's that argument. So but you should remember that this was the argument, right? So most people before Adam Smith believed that the more a country sold to the rest of the world and less it bought, which means that there was a greater inflow of bullion into the country, the richer was the country. That was one strong belief. It's called mercantilism. The other strong belief was physiocracy. Physiocracy was the idea by by people like Quenet, the French economist, who believed that all wealth is generated in agriculture. It is agriculture is the source of all wealth. And Quenet actually then developed a very famous thing called the tableau economy, which is a input-output table. So he actually could then build up a connection of various industries. What is the input from an industry that goes as the output into another industry, and so on and so forth. So actually could build a network of in what are called input-output tables, and in a sense these became important later in the 60s when centralized planning started, and it's even the intellectual roots of planning in India can be traced to Quenet's physiocracy, basically the input-output tables of Quenet, and which were recent. But the idea there, the core idea there was that all wealth comes from agriculture. So two ideas: all wealth comes from agriculture, which was a physiocratic idea, which was in France, and the other important idea was mercantilism. That countries which uh, uh, basically sell more to the world than what they buy, and the idea of economic prosperity is associated with accumulating accumulating bullion, right? So that was the thing. And on this background, Adam Smith wrote a book in 1776 called The Wealth of Nations. Okay? So let's try to understand what is it exactly there, because many times we say that the only idea in the Wealth of Nations is what is called the invisible hand. But actually, there is a very serious argument about what causes economic growth, and that I think is a more interesting kind of an argument in the West of nations. So let me first take you to uh, through the ideas of Adam. So basically some biographical details, and I will strongly refer you to two books. One is a book called The History of Economic Thought, the LSE Lectures by Lionel Robbins, A History of Economic Thought, the LSE Lectures by Lionel Robbins. Yeah, so this was a lecture. Actually, Professor Robbins' series of lectures in the London School of Economics, which were recorded by students and then brought up. It's been edited by Stephen Medema, Medema, and Warren Samuels. Okay. The other book, which is an easy read for those who are not used to, who just want a cursory interest, of course, Evolution of Economic Ideas. So this is the book. You can see this. Can you Evolution of Economic Ideas? Okay, Smith to Sen and Beyond by Vinay Bharat Ram. Okay, Vinay Bharat Ram. And then there is a very famous book by Schumpeter called 10 Great Economists and so on. Okay, those books, of course, you must read. So I think you cannot appreciate Adam Smith without understanding. So let's start with the biography of Adam Smith. Yeah, some biographical details. It's quite interesting. Right? So Adam Smith was born in Scotland in a place called Kirkcaldy in 1723. His father was a civil servant of Kynes. And Adam Smith studied at Glasgow University first under the great Francis Hutcheson. And he studied in 1737 to 1740. And then he had the good fortune, or as you call it, the misfortune, to get a Snell exhibition to Oxford University, Balliol College, where he actually studied for 7 years. What he actually did there is to some extent veiled in mystery. His correspondence isn't very revealing. We know what he thought of Oxford. We know that he thought extremely poorly of the educational arrangements at Oxford. So he wasn't very happy at Oxford. At the University of Oxford, as Adam Smith says, the professors have long ago abandoned even the pretense of teaching. He says this in the Wealth of Nations. Okay, so I don't think he enjoyed his stay at Oxford University very much. But he must have made pretty good use of his time in the libraries there, because he emerged as an extremely well-read man. And from 1748 to 1750, he was a kind of an extension lecturer at Edinburgh University, which then, as of now, was the capital city of Scotland and the home to perhaps 40% of the intellectual life of Scotland. The other 40% being at Glasgow, and the remaining 20% was scattered about the country. In 1751, Smith was made the professor of logic at Glasgow. But in 1752, the chair of moral philosophy having become vacant, he transferred from logic, he went from logic to moral philosophy. And the lectures that he gave there, right, of which we now have two sets of student notes, two sets of student notes have remained, covered a lot of political economy incidentally. Why do I say these two sets of students notes? Because when Adam Smith was dying, he actually called the executors of his estate and asked them to burn all papers except some sundry philosophical papers. So Smith actually got them to burn all his writings. Okay, adding in addition to a new book he was writing. But student notes were discovered by the famous Edwin Cannan in 1896, and a second set of student notes was discovered in Aberdeen in the 50s, and they have been published in a very expensive but very scholarly book issued in celebration of the bicentenary of the Wealth of Nations by the University of Glasgow. So these are very well taken notes. So from those notes also we know what Smith was actually teaching in class. Okay, just like we know from the notes from Lionel Robbins' lecture what actually Professor Robbins taught in class, and notes well taken can actually be good sources of learning, right? So basically in 1759, he worked on that part of the lectures which dealt with moral philosophy. 1759 is an important year in Smith. Everything 1776 is the book that he wrote, but in 1759 Adam Smith worked up these notes as his lecture, what he was teaching as modern philosophy, into a very important book, which is called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Okay? So, Theory of Moral Sentiments is a very important milestone in understanding Adam Smith's economics. Yeah, and this book has become recently, people are reading it much more than what they used to look at earlier. So if you at least get some, and that book is easily downloadable freely, Theory of Moral Sentiments, which Smith wrote in 1759. Then in 1764, he gave up his chair halfway through the session, right? So he didn't complete the whole session, and which is very sinful for a teacher. Now, Townshend, the famous politician who was responsible in many ways for the quarrel with the American colonies, persuaded Smith to accompany the young Duke of Buccleuch on a journey in France. So what used to happen in the 18th century England was the general teaching in higher education systems was so poor that the better-to-do people, who were more right-thinking people, among the aristocrats who ruled the country in those days for the most part, they didn't think they would be getting their sons a good education in English universities, and hence used to send their sons on continental trips, to the continent, and which lasted for about 2 or 3 years. And for the most part, the young men came back, if they had aesthetic tastes, loaded with works of art. Much of the richness of the artistic heritage in England actually comes from the trips of young British aristocrats in Italy and elsewhere. So the politician Townshend, who was also Smith's friend, thought that the young Duke of Buccleuch, who seemed to have been a nice chap and a virtuous man, might actually acquire very bad habits if he were abroad unaccompanied by anybody. And so he conceived, from the Duke of Buccleuch's point of view, the extremely good idea of getting his famous professor to be his companion. And he stayed in France for some time. And it was here that Smith made the acquaintance of the physiocrats. That's where he met Quenet. And he got on quite well with them. He thought well of Quenet, and it is rumored that if Quenet had not been dead, Adam Smith intended to dedicate the Wealth of Nations to him. Not that Smith agreed with Quenet, but he had respect for his character and for his intellect. So all of us will understand that Smith didn't think that all value necessarily always came from agriculture. Right, but he respected Quenet, and therefore he actually wanted to dedicate Wealth of Nations to Francois Quenet, but Quenet unfortunately died before the book could be published. Now in 1766, the Duke's family pensioned Adam Smith off, and for 10 years, Smith spent his time between Kirkcaldy, London, and Edinburgh, writing The Wealth of Nations, which was eventually published in 1776. All of you know that 1776 is also a critical date. It is also the year of American independence. Yes, so in 1776, a lot of things were happening. Then 1779, the French Revolution took place. So that decade of the 70s was a very, very important decade for the world. And also in India, we know that 1770s were the period when the East India Company strongly established its political control over most of India, really. That period between 1765 to 1803 is when the East India Company is expanding its control over India. And we're going to play an important role in what we're going to say later. All right? Okay. So, right. Okay. So in 1776, Adam Smith was made a commissioner of customs, and in 1790, he died. Right? So Adam Smith lived from 1723 to 1790. As you can see, it was a comparatively uneventful life. Yeah. He seems to have got lost when he was a child, and then he was recovered without any damage done. But academically, it's about as favorable as can be conceived. He was a great friend of David Hume, the philosopher. Some of Hume's best letters are written to Adam Smith, and Hume's best letters among the best letters in the English language. So Adam Smith was a recipient of a lot of, so and I think you should sometimes read the correspondence between Adam Smith and David Hume directly. Adam Smith was a great influence in the University of Glasgow. He was apparently quite a good administrator and very highly respected by his colleagues and by his students. Now, you see, Adam Smith actually retired. When he retired halfway, when he retired halfway through a session. Okay, when he went to actually, he went with the Duke of Bukelak to on his trips. As we said, Adam Smith was teaching, and the academic year was not complete. So he retired halfway through the session. Okay, and this weighed very heavily on his conscience. You just leave the syllabus halfway and go. Now that was a period when universities didn't pay salaries directly to professors. It was students who paid the lecturers. If they liked the lecturers, they paid, right? If they didn't like it, they didn't pay, right? So he had made arrangements. So when obviously Smith left, he had made arrangements for a substitute, a good substitute in his judgment. But he thought that the students, who in those days used to pay fees to the lecturers, were not getting a fair deal. And so at his last lecture, he actually carried along with him a bag of silver. And he announced to the students that compelling reasons necessitated his retirement and that his place will be taken and worthily taken by his successor. But he felt that they had not got value for money out of him, and he proposed therefore to give them back a proportionate amount of their fees. So he said, you come and take your fees back. And apparently the student said, oh dear Mr. Smith, we love you so, we really don't want the fees back. And he was so distressed at this that eventually they agreed, and they filed up to on the rostrum, and he dropped in the hands of each of the students a proportionate repayment of the fees. And he is in many respects also an absent-minded fellow. He was a very bad correspondent. He was a companionable, a nice, clubbable man. He belonged to clubs in Glasgow where he had very worthy intellectual companionship. He belonged also to clubs in Edinburgh, and he was sometimes apt to interrupt the conversation by saying out loud that he thought that some person was talking utter nonsense. Now you see, as far as some writers, particularly Schumpeter, has actually said that there was no woman in Adam Smith's life except his mother, right? But if you actually read carefully, David Douglas Stewart's 1811 biographical sketch of Smith, published after Smith's death, he would have, you will know that there was a lady to whom Adam Smith was very attached for many years, and his friends were always very surprised that in the end it didn't end in marriage. He also, when he was a young man, went about with a girl called Jeannie, and that didn't come to anything either. But if Jeannie was not a particularly fascinating person, or at any rate drifted off, Adam Smith and his mother went to a ball, and Jeannie was there, and Adam Smith didn't recognize her. And his mother said to him, Adam, don't you realize that this is your own Jeannie? So there he was, a rather lovable character. And he put political economy on the world map as a serious subject. So that's really a biography of, quick biographical note of Adam Smith. Right? Okay. So let's now begin to tackle the wealth of nations. Okay. Right. And first of all, you see, Wealth of Nations is not a single book. There are actually 5 different books in the Wealth of Nations. Right? And they have long titles. So first book is called Of the Causes of Improvement in the Productive Powers of Labor and of the order according to which its produce is naturally distributed among the different ranks of the people. As you know, Wealth of Nations is freely downloadable, so all of you must check it out, and especially this book 1, which we are going to read together and try and understand. Right? It's called Of the Causes of Improvement in the Productive Powers of Labor. Okay, so what makes labor more productive? And of the order according to which its product is naturally distributed among different ranks of the people. Book 2 is called Of the Nature, Accumulation and Employment of Stock, that is investment. Book 3 is called Of the Different Progress of Opulence in Different Nations. Right, so why are different countries developing at different rates? Why do we have different countries have different levels of output and all that? Book 4 is a huge book, right? Book 4 is very large part, right? Which is of systems of political economy. So there he talks about the mercantile system and the agricultural system. So that's what he calls the Physiplats. And book 5 is called Of the Revenue of the Sovereign or the Commonwealth. Right, so these 5 books constitute the Wealth of Nations. Yeah. Right. Now, the Wealth of Nations, if you try to read the Wealth of Nations, it doesn't come through to you as a proper economics text, right? Because if you look at the economics text, you're used to equations and a proper scientific rigorous argument, right? Okay. But a lot of Adam Smith, for example, book 3, contains a normative of huge amounts of overtones, right? It is clear that he thinks that the progress ought to have been how it has been stopped at different stages. Right, so a lot of it is polemical, especially system chapter book 4 is, the on the systems of political economy is very highly polemical, right? So you'll see Adam Smith making all kinds of sweeping statements. Adam Smith was out to kill the mercantile system, because he didn't think it right that he didn't think that the mercantilism made sense and all the regulations which went with it. And you can see that the scientific part of his book, although once he became airborne, is pretty candid and scientific. It had an overtone of controversy in it that since he was anxious to kill the mercantile system and abolish all sorts of regulations, he was anxious also to set out in a systematic way how the economic system worked in the absence of the mercantile system, or how it would work in the absence of the agricultural system. But the agricultural system, in its judgment, was never likely to come into being, right? So it is also a very, basically Adam Smith takes positions and argues, right? Not necessarily, it's not a very, so it's not like the usual economics books which are neutral, scientific, technical, etc. Parts of Adam Smith books are also his views and his arguments which can be polemical. So let's now start to look at, right, the first part of it, right? Okay, so first part of the book is really the important part, the first book, where it lays down that growth depends on the, so for the first book is about growth, right? What does growth depend upon? To Smith, growth depends upon the division of labor, right? Division of labor is very, very critical to Smith's idea, right? And you all of you must have heard of that great example, right, of where Smith gave of the pin factory, right? So let me read the exact sentences, right? So basically, exactly what did Smith write? I just want to pick up that. Yeah, where is this? Okay, right, and this actually comes from the theory of moral sentiments as well. So this example is not in the Wealth of Nations. This example is in the theory of moral sentiments. Okay, where he says it's about the pin factory. Okay, so it says clearly, one man. So he describes the division of labor in the pin making factory and shows how that actually leads to increase in efficiency. He says one man draws out the wire in the pin factory. One man draws out the wire. Another straightens it. A third cuts it. A fourth points it. A fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head, and so on. These 10 persons, therefore, could make among them upward of 48,000 pins in a day. And then he says, individually, they could make 20, perhaps not one pin in a day. Right? So this is the critical idea in Adam Smith. Right? What does division of labor do? Division of labor actually increases productivity of workers. Okay, right? Why does it do? How and what are the reasons for which it improves the productivity of workers? One, it improves dexterity, right? So that same person, because he's doing the same work again and again and again and again, just a little bit of work, like cutting the pin or giving the pin a head, right? This that specific thing that the person does over and over and over again, the person becomes very skilled at it, right? Secondly, because there is no time lost from shifting from one task to another. And finally, because then you can create specialized machines to actually do specific tasks. So because of three reasons, what division of labor does is division of labor actually creates, improves productivity dramatically. So that was the key idea, right? Okay, sure. And then, okay, and then this is Adam Smith says this happens because of three different circumstances. I again read out that paragraph from. This is owing to three different circumstances. First, the increase of dexterity in every particular workman. Secondly, to the saving of time which is commonly lost in passing from one species of work to another. And lastly, to the invention of a great number of machines which facilitate and abridge labor and enable one man to do the work of many. Right? So this now also has an important philosophical bearing. Right? Okay. Now this was first time a certain approach to human beings. You see, before that, in contrasting, if you contrast it with Plato, right? Plato had emphasized genetic factors in people, right? The inborn differences between people. So what makes some people rich and what makes some people poor is the inborn differences between. Adam Smith, following the tradition of the 18th century Enlightenment and following Locke in this particular respect, thought that we all come into the world with, roughly speaking, equal potentiality, and what happens afterwards is a matter of education and experience, right? Okay. So basically, why is that important? Because it says that if you put in place right institutional structures, then growth can happen anywhere. And what are the right institutional structures? That is the policy part in Adam Smith, right? Okay. So basically, then he says, right? So then he says, what does the division of labor do, right, to society in general? The pin factor is often quoted, as I said, being this proof of the advantage of the division of labor. But if you look at this is in the theory of moral sentiments, not the wealth of nations. But if you look at the last paragraph of chapter 1, okay, of the wealth of nations, then which is much more important than that. And let's read this extract from it. So why does the division of labor actually change society? He says, observe the accommodation of the most common artificer or day laborer in a civilized and thriving country, and you will perceive that the number of people of whose industry a part, though but a small part, has been employed in procuring him this accommodation exceeds all computation. The woolen coat, for example, which covers a day laborer, as coarse and rough as it may appear, is the produce of a joint labor of a great magnitude of workmen. The shepherd, the sorter of the wood, the wool copper or the carder, the dryer, the scribbler, the spinner, the weaver, the fuller, the dresser, with many others, must all join their different arts in order to complete even this homely production. How many merchants and carriers, besides, must have been employed in transporting the materials from some of those workmen to others who often live in very distant parts of the country? How much commerce and navigation in particular? How many shipbuilders, sailors, sailmakers, rope makers must have been employed in order to bring together the different drugs made use of by the dyer, which often come from remotest corners of the world? So that is something which is amazing, as part of current modern day capitalism. That's made possible division of labor. Now, suppose if I want to buy a green shirt with red buttons, if I search hard enough, I'll find it somewhere, right? But who's made that shirt? Right? If you look at the kind of different types of people and organizations which have all come together to produce that one bit of shirt. So maybe the cotton of that shirt was made somewhere in Vidarbha, right? Okay, the machinery to spin that cotton probably came from Germany. The cotton, the thread was spun by a machinery which was made in Germany. Then the cloth maybe went to Bangladesh where it was cut, and the shirt was stitched again with some other machine made in some other part of the world. Okay, the dye, the thread, all the parts of that went into making this shirt actually have made many different parts. Many people from different parts of the world come together. Did they intend to make this shirt? Did they come together because they had this project of making one green shirt with red buttons for Professor Neeraj Jandekar? No. Right? There was a larger system of economic cooperation which brought them together and produced this shirt. Right? So what division of labor does is it actually creates this large network